Team Scotland on making it to the partial double octafinals of the online World Schools Debating Championship. My name is Cindy, and I will be your chair for the round. Can I ask my other panelists to introduce themselves?
Okay, I'm Mark from Singapore.
Hi, I'm Denmark. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, hi, I'm Chaitanya.
Yes.
Sorry, one last attempt. Hi, I'm Chaitanya and I'm from India.
Hi, I'm Katya from South Africa.
All right, and just to have camera and mic checks, can we ask both teams to introduce themselves, starting with the proposition?
I'm Janul, I'll be prop 1.
Chaidu, I'll be prop 2 and reply.
I'm Shalem, I'll be prop 3.
And I'm Lachlan, I will be op 1 and reply.
I'm Freddie, op 2 rather. Good start.
I'm Oscar, I'm going to be op 3.
Okay, and do teams want to agree on a unified method to ask POIs, whether verbally or visually or through text?
We'd
I'm
prefer
good verbally.
All right, sounds good. So without further ado, I call upon the Prime Minister to start this debate.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Panel, globally, countless women, irrespective of who they are or where they happen to come from, live and die hurt by a system of exclusion. Whether it's global narcotics policy, where only 2% of resolutions pander to the interests of women in Eastern Europe, with its interventions in sub-Saharan Africa that uniquely fail to identify that those who are hurt the most on the ground are women and children. With its educational policy in the wake of COVID-19 that fails to account that in countries like Bangladesh, India, and Sri Lanka, the young girls who are sent out of school end up becoming child brides that needs to be catered to. That is because, panel, of a culture where those in the bastions of power globally are overwhelmingly male, where the interests and policies that are dictated on this floor are colored by that narrative. There is a culture where women end up being excluded. We change that. We believe that large institutions should only accept female country delegates. What is our stance inside government? One, the nature of those who are delegates within large international institutions currently happen to be majority and predominantly male. That is because most governments tend to be male because of structural exclusion in terms of women being denied the vote, for instance, and a general culture of patriarchy. But what does it mean within international institutions? That means that the issues that are dictated are colored from a male lens. That means that you are unable to break into these institutions, you're unable to have your issues spoken about, you're unable to solve their oppression because of this. But note that this doesn't mean that you don't have any female delegates at all. You do. You have institutions which sometimes end up having female leaders, but this cannot be solved by a bottom-down approach where you simply hope that countries are going to be sending female representatives. So we acknowledge that there are a few women, but they're too little and not enough to solve the issues structurally. So that means that any kind of policy I'm going to talk about depends on the goodwill of oppressors. You need the men in power in institutions like the UN to dictate policy, to frame issues in the perspective of women. That is not good enough. But second,
point of information.
Institutions look like they're characterized by wielding significant power. They dictate policy both globally and regionally, and they often are characterized by a large buy-in across the region. Organizations like the World Bank, the IMF, and the UN. Third, female country delegates would look like representatives that portray the interests of their own country. We think there's a surplus of qualified individuals that end up pencil pushing that would otherwise now have a seat as delegates. They would then have an autonomy of voting of issues. They're able to lobby individually or collectively. They're able to bring up issues within these institutions. finally, this wouldn't be for all time. This representation would only exist until we're able to get a modicum of redress. That is, that within states, you have the issues of women being catered to, both globally and regionally. Two burdens then. One, that this policy is in the obligation of international institutions. Two, that this helps women across the world. You're going to hear two arguments in my speech. First, as to why there is an obligation by international institutions. Second, as to how this helps women on the ground. Shanti will give you a third argument as to how this helps women when you have central figures of power. Before I move into my first argument, sure, I'll take the point. Your point, sir?
Yes. How likely is Saudi Arabia to let a woman speak for their country?
That is irrelevant in the scope of this debate. If they don't want to send a representative, we'd simply be fine with that. In the majority of instances, we think that buy-in exists. First argument then as to why there's an obligation by international institutions. And here, notice the nature of these associations and the way women are specifically shut out and the reason it cannot be solved. That is because there's a stereotype conception of what these organizations need to look like, that you need to be authoritarian, that you need to be strong. Things that are fed off the patriarchy that was allowed to exist, that are pushed by men, that are unable to be broken by individual women. That means in their the comparative they need to defend is a structural exclusion in terms of women that are simply unable to get in the majority of instances, and even when they are in, they're unable to make change. First, why does this obligation exist?
Points of information.
The way these international institutions were structured and created, institutions like the UN and the World Bank were created with the precedent that you wanted to make the world a fairer place, that you didn't want the inequality that perpetrated across the world to exist, to prevent that kind of conflict. In that instance, the severe inequality that exists in terms of women not getting policy that serves their interests, not being pandered to, is a structural form of failure. But second, women have been failed in other ways as well. They've been actively excluded in every single country from these structures of power. They've been denied the vote, so they were unable to be a part of when the systems were formed. The systems were built up without them, and there was a failure to implement policy that made their lives better in that aftermath. But third, institutionally, they were failed as well. In terms of institutions like the UN, they were actively negligent in ensuring that there was policy that served the interests of women. They enabled the oppression to continue. We think negligence is just as culpable here. What does that mean? It means that in this instance, you are predicated to do everything in your power to redress the harms you exacted on them. The fact that they've been excluded, the fact that their interests have not been catered to, that you have women literally being raped in India because you as an institution failed. Because we concede that they cannot go into these countries and force them to change their policy. That means the next best thing is to ensure that structurally they change their policy because they want to buy into the UN. But second, there's a vicarious responsibility that attaches from the fact that these institutions have significant power and clout. That means it's not good enough to stand on the sidelines and depend on the goodwill of the oppressor in individual states to fix the system, to give women that kind of redress. But finally, why is this?
Point of information.
Because there's a global issue. Every single woman in every single state has been collectively failed by the world as a whole. But second, female disenfranchisement is disenfranchisement of a majority. It's literally like 51% of the population across the world that is inexcusable in any instance. So therefore, categorically, what they require as recompense is being re-included within the system, being given that say that can only be achieved when you have 100% of women within these systems. And that means that in their world, the comparative they need to defend is that continued exclusion. But second argument then as to how this helps women on the ground. But I just want you to note that buy-in is likely into these institutions irrespective of what goes on. That is because buying into organizations like the UN, the EU, and the World Bank have a significant amount of benefits that accrue because of it. An inclusion in trade deals, the access to a nuclear umbrella, the veto power, the fact that you have a seat at the table as to when policy is dictated. So countries are going to have to buy in regardless. What does that mean first in terms of policy? Because notice, we can see that you might have some men who claim to speak for men. But even in those instances, these structures are inherently patriarchal, so there's very little benefit for them to actively continue to lobby for women. But second, even if that were true, that they cared about women and knew about the issues, even in those instances, women are a secondary priority, where there are other issues that take precedence. So catering to women is often like at the bottom of the list when you're figuring out what kind of intervention you want to do in sub-Saharan Africa. But second, even if they say that there are some women in politics currently, they are blocked out because they're unable to gain traction, because they don't consolidate enough mass, but because there's also a normative perception that they're unable to make this kind of change. That means uniquely in our world, the comparative you get is one where women dictate what kind of policy gets passed, where they have the pulpit to decide which issues get discussed, where you're able to send funding to women and highlight their oppression. But second, you normalize having women in power. That is, when you see women representing your country, the normative message you then send is that women are capable of succeeding, that they can lead. But notice that this ties into national pride. So even in countries like Saudi or Sri Lanka that might be sexist, the fact that you have a nationalist pride built up on your representative means you are proud of your representative when they succeed, if they give a good speech in the UN, for instance. That internal policy shift means you're likely to get more support from women, more buy-in from men as well. But what is the impact of this? The impact is you have a massive consciousness raising. More women on the street are likely to rally around figures of power, where you're likely to see this change as being able to happen. And there's more buy-in in the part of men as well. Ultimately, then locally, you engineer better policy. Globally, you engineer better policy that caters to their needs for all these reasons proposed.
Speakers spoke for 8 minutes, 13 seconds. I thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech and call upon the Leader of Opposition.
Can you hear me? Awesome.
Yes.
In their response to a point of information in their first speech, Sri Lanka allowed their motion to become limited in its scope to only some of the most privileged women in the world and to very directly exclude the actors that we have to care about most in this debate. It's because side opposition will show you in this speech and in the coming speeches why we are the side that gives you the world which caters to women in the best possible way, which resolves the inequality side proposition so eloquently talks about in a manner that is actually impactful and that caters to the women who need it most, not excludes them, right? We'll bring you three things in our case today. Firstly, on some brief alternatives. Secondly, why the motion undermines global politics and feminism. And thirdly, in my partner's speech, about why the motion comes at the cost of intersectionality. But before I get into that, I want to give some rebuttal to the previous speaker, because the first thing that we get is this quite lengthy principled case about why we have an obligation from these international institutions because they were founded to make the world a fairer place and they failed to do that so far. So we have an obligation principally to solve this, right? We don't really have a problem with this. We don't really have a problem with the vast majority of this principle. We are very happy to accept that yes, it is the obligation of these international institutions and of us as speakers to try and make the world a better place and resolve the structural sexism that exists there. But note that the only conclusion given on a particularly analytical level here is that we have a burden to tackle inequality, which it is then asserted can only be achieved with this extremely radical, extremely specific motion that side proposition gives you here. We do not think this has sufficiently been linked to the very specific mechanism they lay out. We'd like to hear more analysis there. But secondly, in their second speech, they talk to us about why seeing a representative from your country gives you national pride, and you suddenly realize, as a previously raging sexist, that women are really competent because you see a woman speaking at the UN. No, thank you. We just don't really buy into this because we tell you that at the point at which you have come from a political system which is so oppressive to women, as they like to characterize, it is really, really unlikely that you have never seen a woman do anything competent before. We don't think that this sexism is grounded in very rational reasoning, and we think that it's also really, really likely that you still are an irrational actor even when you see a woman speaking for your country, right? You are still far more likely as someone with innate biases to pick up on mistakes that she makes or to pick up on inadequacies of this new all-female United Nations or World Bank, right? We think that is a really problematic thing. We don't think they give sufficient analysis as to why that's going to be the case there. No, thank you. We also tell you that in terms of the mechanisms that they give to solve the fact that women's issues are not focused on enough at the UN, we will give you alternatives in this speech. So onto those alternatives, right? What kinds of things do we support inside opposition? Because we think there is a litany of things that we can support and we can say we would rather happen than this motion, right? We think that that can look like affirmative action to get more women into the United Nations. We think that can look like more affirmative action to get women higher up, both in domestic politics and international politics. We're really happy for that to happen. It might look like funding and schemes as already exist to improve women's education and financial support worldwide, whether that's politically through the UN or financially through the World Bank, through various different things that exist there. It might also look like more diplomatic pressure on countries that currently have unequal rights to women, for women, in order to like get them more on board with women's rights.
Yeah.
Right? We prefer these for two reasons. No, thank you. Firstly, we tell you that this actually solves the root issues that tend to drive sexism, right? That tend to drive institutionalized patriarchy, because it starts to deal with the fact that so often women are seen as less qualified because they're not given opportunities or because they're not given the capital to be able to succeed, right? We think that is far preferable to lift up all women, to use these kinds of schemes, this kind of action, this kind of pressure in order to lift all women up, rather than just uplifting those women who are already at the top of the political sphere, who have already been able to navigate that patriarchy, right? We far prefer that as a mechanism. But secondly, we just tell you on a very basic level, these other alternatives don't provide the active harms of completely locking all men out of these organizations. These are the harms that we think are quite self-evident when we look at how massively like draconic and radical a move this is, something which really hasn't been sufficiently justified by the Prime Minister, and something that we're going to talk a lot about throughout my speech. So onto this substantive case of why the motion is catastrophic for both global politics and for feminism. So we ask, like, what is the current position of global feminism? We think it's not great, but it's also really varied, right? Because there are some countries, particularly in places like Western liberal democracies, where feminism is generally more accepted. There tends to be more female leaders, but institutionalized patriarchy still massively exists, right? There is still a massive extra level of scrutiny for female politicians and public figures. There is a still like a massively institutionalized lack of opportunities for women. We think in far worst case scenarios, there might be political systems where women don't have the same rights still, and like are much more like directly and harmfully discriminated against and not given opportunities, and like just given really bad opportunities, right? But then let's look at the contemporary political outlook on NGOs, because we don't think it's great, right? We don't think people at the moment are becoming more and more aware of how brilliant and wonderful NGOs are, right? We're living since the post-war consensus in an unprecedented time of like skepticism of the international order, right? This looks like Trump wanting to pull out of loads of different international organizations when America has previously been one of the biggest supporters. This looks like the UK leaving the European Union. This looks like massive skepticism of internationalism and growing like nationalism and like belief in the corruption of the institutions and their inherent flaws, right? That is the point at which we take issue with the proposition line of why countries just have to buy into these institutions no matter what they say, because they're very important. Even before these institutions have taken such controversial political views as they propose, there is still massive skepticism and massive like desire within these countries to pull out of them, to withdraw funding, to like just not buy into them as much. That's the point at which we see they are already on a really shaky footing, one that proposition completely removes, right? We think, I'll take POI.
The other solutions that you've talked about in the beginning of your speech have existed for decades, but yet we see a vast disproportionate amount of women in the UN. Why is that the case?
Okay, right. Like we'd be really happy to step those up and like put more funding into them, right? We think we are able to propose under our side that doing that is just a better solution than the massive one that you propose. We would prefer to do that, right? So how might countries therefore react to this motion, given that like there are so many different barriers to their buy-in and to their buy-in to feminism, right? We think that they just likely see this as like a final straw of these global institutions, given that patriarchy and sexism are so baked into these countries. We think it is so unlikely that they take well to the idea that now they have to send women to these institutions, and there's this really radical move to completely eliminate men from the process, right? There's a sliding scale of reactions to that, but it might just look like total withdrawal, right? Especially in countries that we want to be really involved in the international process, especially countries like Saudi Arabia, like Iran, that are going to be so unhappy and reluctant to allow a woman to speak for the whole country and be the representative of that country in the international community community. That is just not something they're going to tolerate. It is really likely they pull out of these institutions. It might just look like even less funding, further scuppering the institutions and allowing them so much less like ability to actually change things, ability to actually like, you know, fund more women's projects and that sort of thing. It looks like less buy-in. It looks like the fact that Iran is now just less happy to like negotiate nuclear deals and is probably just going to walk away from the table and not see these as viable institutions because its political capital has been so undermined. Because we give you a global order that is massively undermined by the proposition's motion, we are so happy to oppose.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes, 20 seconds. I thank the Leader of Opposition for that fine speech and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Also, yeah, I'm fine with you turning off your video if the teams are.
Hi, can you hear me if I speak like this?
Yes.
Okay, great. Panel, just because opposition does not engage with our principle doesn't make it any less important to this debate. Because notice the argument that we drew in first page was not a generic argument that we should support some kind of reform, but it was about the specific obligation of international organizations. And I'm very quickly going to reiterate that. Because what John told you was that these organizations were created with the founding principle of addressing the problems that exist in the world. The UN was created in the aftermath of World War II, for example, so that such an incident would never occur. The World Bank was created in order to prevent things like economic recessions. Therefore, in instances where we can identify systemic biases that don't just exist in one or two developing countries, but exist throughout the world, in every single country they considered that sexism does exist, then it is the impetus and mandate of international organizations to do everything in their power and fiat to address these inequalities. Giving women some quotas and some additional representation isn't doing everything in your power, panel. Only on our side of the house do international organizations fulfill their mandate of catering to women as best they can by giving them 100% of that representation. Let me move on then to 3 areas of response. Firstly, about the role of international organizations. This is largely focused on the counter solution. Secondly, on whether buy-in will exist. Thirdly, on how this is better for women. After that, I'll deal with my argument about how you create strong female leaders. The first idea then of the role of international organizations. I've already pointed out that they're not doing everything in their power and fulfilling their mandate. But the specific counter solution that we get from opposition is quite rather like contradictory with all of the analysis that we get from them. On one hand, they argue we shouldn't have this kind of reform, for example, because there are a bunch of Eurosceptics that are going to be pulling out of the EU. But why wouldn't that same kind of reaction exist against referendums, or rather not referendums, but rather having things like quotas, for example, for these women? We think that you're just as likely to see the same sliding scale of reactions when you attempt to increase the level of representation that women have in status quo. And I think the response to the POI is particularly important, because they said if it's not enough to address equality right now, we're more than happy to increase the level of quotas that you have. On a balance panel, I think they're coming much closer to our case, where you have 100% of the women, because on their side of the house, then it's reasonable to assume that women will be the majority of delegates. We don't really see the distinction that exists between the two sides. But finally, I think that counter solution just does not materialize in the real world, because in order to have things like greater diplomatic sanctions in instances where women are being discriminated, you actually need to see those policies passed in these forums and international conventions. That's never going to happen for all of the reasons that Zhang gave you. They have have not responded to, about how often catering to women and thinking about the intersectional impacts of a military intervention, for example, are often a secondary priority to men who are unable to relate to the lived experiences of women. The second area of analysis or area of rebuttal then on buying. And I want to notice just how crucial this area of response is, because the vast majority of their harms about countries pulling out are based on the fact that you will not have buy-in to this policy. Why do you think buy-in will exist? One, because of the immense benefits that exist when you are part of an international organization, because you have access to economic ties and trade with other countries, because you have access to diplomatic pressure in order to insulate your own country, for example, from things like military interventions. I think the opportunity cost associated with not being a part of this organization doesn't really match up to just having to have like one female delegate. I mean, come on, panel, it's not that hard to just have one woman in power for once. But secondly, this is just an argument against having any change at all, because to the point at which you try to have any reform in these international forums, there's going to be some amount of backlash. That's something that we need to learn to deal with. And this has happened in the past. When you set referendums, like they very rightly pointed out, there probably was backlash from these countries, but that didn't stop us from having these kinds of reforms. But thirdly, I would argue that even the most conservative countries, and especially conservative and sort of like these controversial countries, have it in their best interest to remain a part of these organizations. Because when Saudi Arabia is not a part of the UN, then the rivals of Saudi Arabia, those individuals who want to see Saudi Arabia delegitimized in the international community, can uniquely bank on the fact of this international organization. That's an opportunity cost that they won't take. But the second thing about how like Euroscepticism is like a really big deal, that's for purely economic reasons. Look at Brexit, for example. They didn't want to have like Brexit, and the Britons didn't want to have Brexit just because they wanted like more women in power. That was because the EU was failing them as an international organization. If that does exist, I think it exists equally on both sides of the house. The impact that having one female delegate has is extremely marginal. Not in that it is marginal in the benefits accrue, but I think the cost to an individual country compared with the benefits just does not match up. So the vast majority of the benefits don't materialize. But the third and final area of analysis on how this is better for women, and they still haven't dealt with the crux of our argument, which is that in the absence of having female delegates that have the autonomy to do things like vote on resolutions, that have the autonomy to do things like form power blocks in order to get resolutions passed, you rely on the goodwill of men. Men who have systematically shown that they're willing to consider women a secondary priority. Men who have consistently shown they're bigoted enough not to take the concerns of women who are disproportionately the victims of bad international policy into account. They rely on the goodwill of individuals. But before I move on, yes, your point.
When Saudi Arabia is a member of the United Nations, it allows funding to go towards women's empowerment in the country. Why are your side so happy to risk that?
And they will likely continue to remain members of this organization. I've already dealt with this. But the thing that they tell us as to how this is going to get worse for women is that you create a confirmation bias. One, I would argue that the fact that you want qualified delegates to represent you in an international forum actually means that the women who used to be pencil pushing and research teams for the actual male delegates are now likely to get the prominent position of power, but they're all also going to get like assets in terms of the training and research necessary in order to improve these kinds of things. But even if confirmation bias does exist to some degree, sexism exists on both sides of the house. So even if organically a woman gets into power on their side of the house, backlash would still exist. Is that a reason not to have any of these women in power? I don't know. But finally, I think what we allow women to do is put them in a position of power where they can disprove the bigots, where they can say, despite the fact that I'm a woman and you think I'm incompetent, I have the ability to succeed. I think when you tie this to the fact that you are a national representative, it becomes all the more stronger. Finally, the idea that there's a variation in feminism. I think the concession they make, I don't really get the point, but the concession they make is that structural discrimination exists across the world that further reinforces our principle. The final argument then as to how you create strong female leaders. Two areas of analysis here. Firstly, the immediate tangible trickle-down effects of having a woman in power. Because these delegates are immensely powerful individuals, even in their own home states. They have the ability to delegate their own research teams, for example. They have the ability to decide who works in their offices. What do you think a world in which a woman occupies this position would look like? One, we think that she would be able to hire more women in places where they have structurally had a glass ceiling placed against them. So the research teams that are responsible for compiling research, for example, are more likely to be representative. Secondly, she can uniquely change power structures in these organizations, where the analysis that we gave you about how often male stereotypes of puffing your chest out and a appearing to be aggravating are generally considered to be like conflated with how successfully as a delegate, I think you're able to break down those kinds of things. But thirdly and finally, as an individual woman, we make her richer and we have the ability to give her like economic liberty. I think that's just like a good in and of itself. But finally, on the power of the office, because I think when you are a national delegate, that gives you immense political clout. It gives you a stage on which you can speak about women's issues. And we've already seen this happening to some degree with individuals like Emma Watson, for example, who is a youth delegate for the UN. We think that all of the benefits then of having media support for these kinds of things across the world, given that this happens in every country, is far, far greater than what you likely see with limited representation on their side of the house. All of the benefits that they accrue, we do better, and we fulfill the mandate of international organizations whilst doing them side with side proposition.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes, 17 seconds. I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech and call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1, now. Proposition have been remarkably unstrategic in their attempts to prove why 100% of representatives in these bodies should be female. Firstly, they've mostly established framing that demonstrated that yes, patriarchy exists. We're going to co-opt this analysis. We largely agree patriarchy exists. Second, they haven't justified their motion sufficiently over the alternatives we provide. Firstly, I'm going to do rebuttal. Secondly, going to do substantive about how this comes to the exclusion of other marginalized groups. Okay, on to rebuttal. Firstly, on will countries buy in? We want to look at the reasons for why proposition have said countries will buy in. Firstly, they say that states are going to get a seat at the table. At the point at which they say that they can opt out, we absolutely think there's a contradiction, a tension in their case. We don't think that's a standing reason. But secondly, they say that these organizations provide benefits for which they'll remain a member. Let's weigh this. We think, firstly, a benefit that's provided is trade, but then they say, actually, the UK only withdrew from the EU for economic reasons. We don't think, first of all, that this is even true. We think that there's been a simmering global sentiment that is anti-globalization, anti-global organizations. This is why the UK withdrew from the EU for reasons beyond just economic, including democracy, including immigration. No, thank you. But we think also that the US is also itching to leave these organizations. We think, secondly, many countries like Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran are incredibly sexist to the point where they'll outright withdraw from these organizations because they don't want to be humiliated because they're sending a woman to these organizations. We don't think that these countries see enough benefit of these organizations to send their representatives. No, thank you. Thirdly, to add nuance, we think that there's a certain level of sexism that won't exist in the most radical of these countries, but still relatively sexist countries like India, like China, like the US, like Brazil, where they'll massively withdraw funding from these organizations to the point where their ability to achieve their aims becomes massively curtailed. Secondly, I want to talk about is it international organizations' obligation to entirely exclude men from these organizations? No, thank you. We think their proposition is unbelievably radical, and there's a massive problem-solution gap. We think, if anything, first proved by establishing that patriarchy exists, why we should use our alternatives. We don't think that every man should lose power. 2 additional reasons for why this exclusion is extra bad. Firstly, on the efficiency of our countermeasures. We think the trajectory of these countermeasures over the past several decades has been unbelievably positive. We've had massive gains for women's rights as a result of these countermeasures as they exist. No, thank you. But secondly, they're not being done to the extent that they could be done. And we think they can only be done to the extent they can be done to when there's funding available for it. You only get this funding when states buy in. Secondly, on their failure to identify this obligation principally correctly. We disagree that there's a distinction between these two sides. We think the difference is between like picking a banana from a tree and 3D printing something that looks like a banana and calling it the same thing. We think that there's a massive, there's a necessary distinction between how you come to something. We think Latin was able to prove that. No, thank you. Next rebuttal. What does it take to get policy which helps women? We think that proposition have used a chainsaw for what required scissors. We don't think that you necessarily need to exclude every single man. This isn't required. We think the level of backlash this generates among countries is unjustifiable. And finally, to respond to the second speaker's substantive, we think that yes, sure, you objectively will get more global women's voices, but we think that by the same token, if you make every single person in a parliament an ethnic minority, there will also be more global ethnic minority voices. This isn't a justification for why they should do that. We think this is a tautology and contingent on their first speaker's material. Yes, please.
One makes the argument that feminism is diverse and therefore 200 countries have varying needs and interests for their women. How then would a quota system, which only gets a certain percentage of women from some countries, pander to all those unique interests?
This POI demonstrates that proposition haven't actually listened to our countermeasures. At no point did we say quota. We said affirmative action, we said funding, we said diplomatic pressure. This is completely different. Okay, on to substantive. So we think, substantive on why this comes to the exclusion of other marginalized groups. We say most of the women that will be selected for these international bodies will be wealthy, they'll be straight, they'll be university educated, they'll come from the most powerful ethnic group in their country. We want proposition to justify why white women in Brazil, the USA, and South Africa can replace black men, and we see those black men's interests no longer represented in these bodies. No, thank you. We acknowledge that there's already an underrepresentation of these other marginalized groups under the status quo, but 5 reasons why these groups lose power in these institutions under the motion. Firstly, on the level of social hurdles that people have to leap through. We think the more oppressed your background is, the more hurdles you have to overcome. What this means is this is why the ratio between white to black men in the parliament is generally more equitable than the ratio between white to black women in parliament. There have only ever been 2 female black senators. Second reason, we say the leaders of many grassroots movements tend to be men. It's easier to be a male leader of a civil rights or a class struggle organization. These are really important movements. Having these leaders is really valuable as representatives. No, thank you. Thirdly, the pool of representatives to draw from is quite small for female candidates, to the point where there aren't many ethnic minorities to begin with. This motion selects women who have already conquered the rigmarole of life. They meet all of society's expectations. It excludes women that didn't. Fourthly, we say that there's an acceptance a woman must meet to achieve power in society. To be a woman who has power, you can't be rough around the edges. You're not allowed to be. Society has a much higher expectation for you than they have for a man. You must be university educated. You must be well spoken. You must be successful. No, thank you. We say there's much more leeway for men to have for example, a working class accent than a woman, because there's lower expectations for them. At this point, women who are accepted in the national discourse are much more privileged. Fifthly, we say that there's a level of lip service and box checking that exists under proposition. We say world leaders who appoint representatives have got a box to check and they feel it's already been checked. Because we're already appointing a woman, why would we need to appoint an ethnic minority? We say, furthermore, our countermeasures aim to break this privilege pipeline at an earlier stage. Affirmative action, funding and schemes for women and financial support, and diplomatic pressure in countries with unequal rights for women allow this pipeline to be broken before people have already got to the end of it. What that means is the people who are at the end of it are immensely privileged. What we get to do is we destroy the foundation and we get people to break this privilege in the first place. Finally, proposition lead to a mission accomplished mentality. If you've already got a quota of 100% women, there's less incentive to make more strides. So in order to win this debate, Prop have got to justify why we have to do such a radical policy which alienates so many countries. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes, 14 seconds. I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that fine speech and call upon the government whip.
Can I be heard if I speak like this?
Yes.
Thank you. I know the extent of side opposition's principal argumentation is, we agree, let's give them other things, let's give them affirmative action, let's give them funding, let's have international pressure. Sure, this can stand as a standalone principal argument, but we don't think that they resolve the tension this creates with the rest of their case. If it is true that affirmative action can include things like quotas, if funding comes at opportunity cost, if international pressure puts an onus on governments to change, why isn't it that the same harms that they talk about in their second argument or the skepticism of international organizations, why isn't it that it is also true that other marginalized groups will also lose out as a result of things like funding going more to women than other groups? Why isn't all that true? They have to resolve this tension. But I think I'm going to pick and choose which arguments they actually prefer. I think that they prefer this argument, since the argument that we should have other forms of funding, because that otherwise they lose the principle, they lose the debate. In that instance, they dilute the vast majority of their other arguments in their case. Then they concede that buy-in will still exist despite going against the interests of countries and putting a woman in power. They concede that it doesn't matter even if it's the most privileged woman at the point at which you get benefits otherwise. 3 points of clash in this speech. First, on the obligation of international institutions, why 100% is the only way to go. Secondly, in the incentives of individual countries. Thirdly, and finally, on how women globally are benefited as compared to their side. I'll take your POI.
Given just how deeply embedded misogyny is in every country in the world, why do NGOs continue to be seen as equally powerful and legitimate when they're made all female?
Okay, I don't quite understand that point. If your argument is NGOs can do lots of things as well, we agree with that. But the fact is that it's not enough, and that's not like the redress that women require. First clash then, on the obligation of international institutions. First, I'm going to deal with the opposition analysis that there are other mechanisms and take them at their best, that they have other mechanisms to solve issues. First, we think that these other mechanisms are unlikely to manifest fast enough. Why is this the case? Because it is a bottom-down approach as opposed to the top-down approach that we talked about. That is to say, it is down to the micro nuances of individual policies in individual countries that have not worked for decades and decades panel, where women's liberation of like the vote, for example, started in 1918 or something, but the fact is that there are still less voter turnout for women right now. That these policies have existed for so long, but we have not seen the kind of redress that we require. But secondly, in the answer to their POI, they said, we're happy to do much more than we already do for women. This is a concession that the current mechanisms don't work, not because we don't give it enough funding, but because structurally it just takes too long and does not actually cater to the structural biases that exist in these countries. The structural biases that exist is the perception of women, the idea of what women should be, the idea that women cannot be forceful, so that they cannot be assertive. These are the ideas that we uniquely combat by virtue of putting women in power, which they don't get as much on their side of the house. But secondly, this does not deal with the principal argumentation we gave you that it deserves 100% of representation. I'm going to give you 3 reasons why it is 100%. The first, which they have not responded to yet, is that you need to do everything in your power. At the point at which they concede an obligation, at the point at which they recognize that institutions have failed women in the past, and therefore should do every single thing in their power. What necessarily translates from everything in their power is giving 100%. Categorically, they're required to do everything in their control, everything in their power. This is analysis that I haven't dealt with. We gave this from first, a bit late in op third and reply. They need to tell us why any less is something of is justified, given that it is like the single greatest failure of these institutions to not represent a majority in the world, but still considered as a minority. But secondly, we told you that women's disenfranchisement happens in every single country. The fact is you're sending one representative from every country in the world. The fact that women have been failed exists in every country in the world, regardless of how developed or underdeveloped it is. Therefore, there's an obligation to make sure that each woman from every single country is a woman, because the fact is that failure exists in every single country in the first place. They have not responded to that, again, a bit late in op 3 and reply. But thirdly, the degree of harm to which women have been suffocated under in the course of history. No, thank you. I took one, I won't take another. The degree of harm is substantial. The fact that they have been actively excluded, that systems were built without them, that this goes against their founding principle. The fact that you could have done a lot of things before, but you haven't. That policies only cater to 2%, like 2% of policies only cater to women who suffer under the abuse of drugs, for example. All which she told in first speech, which they haven't responded to. If it's the difference between 90% and 100% of how much you should care about women, we think you should, at that point, you have to stand on our side of the house. This is something they haven't dealt with. We think this wins us the debate, because the principle is the most important thing. Regardless of any practical other outcome, at the point at which you recognize that this is a principle in the debate, and you recognize it deserves 100%
information.
It outweighs any other thing, because the organization is categorically responsible for doing it, and anything else is fundamentally unjust. Second clash then, no thank you, on the incentives of individual countries. And here they simply tell us there's skepticism of international organizations. This will be the final straw. 3 responses. The first is that there are specific examples of like global sentiments are shiftable. That is to say that they can change according to the age or the time. For example, Biden looks like he's going to become president, then he will be involved in the UN. The fact that Brexit was a bad idea has been acknowledged by a majority of individuals right now. This is very much down to the socio-political climate of the time, where they can shift either way. But secondly, the specific examples that they gave of like the Paris Agreement is pulling out of individual policies, specific policies. They have never just removed themselves from the UN, because then they lose every single other benefit that the UN has. So sure, even women in the American woman would pull out the Paris Agreement, even if we agree to that. The fact is that they would stay in the UN to do everything else. No, thank you. But thirdly, we think it's likely that Saudi and Iran are still going to send women, because it is PR, right? It's a signal in effect that they're willing to go to the other side because they want to get better trade deals, because they want to be seen as a good person. But the flip of that is something that they haven't responded to, that you're likely to be stigmatized by your rifles, that you're likely to be called out by the rest of the international community. The fact that you give greater power for women in that country, like in Saudi and Iran, the fact that you get global solidarity for women at the point which you are the only villain compared to all the other countries around you. We don't think that this stands on their side. But even if some countries pull out, we think that's fine, because it's the fact that every single other country now has an ability to cater for women, has an ability to actually, at the point which they concede that there is sexism in every single part of the world. In fact, you should not care about that minority of instances, because then in every single other country around the world, which exists in the middle of that sexist spectrum, we give women benefits, therefore we win that clash. Finally then, on women globally benefiting. The first thing to say here is that their one-line response that you have raging sexist and therefore you're not going to convince them, we don't think that's comparative. Even their policies would not work on raging sexist. What matters in this debate are the middle ground, the implicit biases, the stereotypes that exist on the ground. Those are things that are broken at the point at which you consider your national representative to be a woman. The fact that that is a person who you should look up to. The fact that there now are the opportunity to disprove bigots. The fact that you have strong female leaders who have political clout, who can campaign for things within their own country. All of these are substantial benefits which they don't get on their side of the house. And at the point at which we benefit the majority of women around the world who are systematically oppressed, you then should side with us. But finally, on that third argument about other marginalized groups, right? We think that can still exist on both sides. It's not like you can be a woman, but you can't be black, right? If there's a black man in the UN right now, it's going to change into a black woman. There's still intersectionality between men and women and other marginalized groups. But secondly, even if it's only the most privileged women who get into power right now, that's symmetric for one, that's on their side as well. But we think that's fine, because the most privileged white woman would still give policy that better benefits women in general than a man for whom it is the third priority and they need to deal with other things in the first place. We don't care fundamentally, even if it is the most privileged of women, because we care about women as a global group, right? The fact that they are otherwise excluded. The comparative on their side of the house is one in which women will never get into power, will never be able to campaign for their interests. For all these reasons, I'm so proud to propose.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes, 15 seconds. I thank the government whip for that fine speech and call upon the opposition whip.
Can you hear me? Oh, wait, 1 second. Can you hear me now? Cool.
Yes.
Prop's case today has been riddled with contradictions. They tell you the same patriarchal elites who have ruled a country for hundreds of years will now suddenly allow these ambassadors massive political clout. They tell you countries with deeply ingrained principled and structural misogyny will abandon this in favor of staying in all-female NGOs like the UN that they themselves admit will no longer be seen as legitimate. They tell you that the minority women on the ground in these very countries are the most vulnerable, and yet give you a case that works exclusively in the interests of the elite. Panel, don't let them get away with this. You're going to judge this debate on two issues. The first is about the international implications of this motion, and the second is about which side gets better gender equality. I'm going to deal with each of these in turn. Firstly, we told you from the very first minute of our speech that countries withdrawing from organizations like the UN is terrible for geopolitics on the whole. Lacan gives you structural reasons that are never engaged with as to why this happens, like ingrained political misogyny. Organizations are no longer seen as legitimate actors in the eyes of these countries themselves because they are no longer seen as like having like viable leadership. We tell you there is little benefit to the elites ruling these countries of these actual organizations. Note that the economic benefits that they tell you so desperate that they are so desperate to tell you will keep them within these organizations looks like the World Bank funding girls' education. We don't think actors like Mohammed bin Salman really care that much about this. No responses other than the economic benefit, and note it is also very telling that they dropped this response after their second case. Okay, so what are the impacts that never go engaged with of this case? We tell you that there's more international tension when Russia no longer diplomatically engages, when actors like Russia no longer diplomatically engage with actors like the US. We tell you this results in a more unstable world where we likely get more misogyny within these countries at the point at which they no longer have to do stuff like, or at least like bring symbolic feminist change in order to engage well with diplomacy. No, thank you. Secondly, on intersectional representation, Freddie gives you barriers analysis in his second speech and tells you that we lose all minority representation within these organizations themselves. Even if that case as a whole is entirely true, we tell you feminism on the comparative can't come at the cost of increased racism, right? We get no responses from P3 to this until the last 30 seconds of his speech, and no response to the specific barriers analysis about how this means that we inevitably will get less minority representation. The impact of this is that Prop leaves behind all but the most privileged. Okay. Secondly, on to better gender equality. The premise of that case here, no thank you, is that UN representation deconstructs mindsets. Three responses. Firstly, we told you from the very first minute of our case today that these actors are unlikely to stay in the UN in many countries, like Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Thailand. Men in these countries feel threatened at the point at which they see that the leadership of that country is threatened. Right? This is strategically, these are often the most strategically important countries and also important to feminism. Right? Proposition doesn't even care about women. Proposition cares more about like more female billionaires in this situation than like tackling sex-based oppression. Okay. It's also important to note that we told you that this misogyny is not based on rationality. So even in the case where their economic responses are true, we tell you this has very little impact on the leadership, who are much more concerned with saving their own skins and jobs than like economic benefits to their people. Secondly, ambassadors are probably more stigmatized within these countries, right? Note that they are given no stake by the elite, as is against the tradition, and they have no incentives to properly engage with these ambassadors or World Bank representatives. They are demonized by the population themselves. Like even even in America, probably the best environment for Prop's case. Look at the reaction to like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, where she's been harassed and abused by people themselves. We tell you that this reaction is likely to be drastically amplified when there is such misogyny and such hatred against these figures. No, thank you. The impacts of this rebuttal are we get less feminism within these countries as it becomes popular to voice dissent against these figures, and it contributes to a herd mentality again and witch hunt against feminists, right? Secondly, less liberalism as ambassadors import values from the UN into these countries, right? Which leads to more progressivism. This looks like Jordan, Vietnam, all positive case studies in this case, which makes because these ambassadors want to import this progressivism in order to make their life in the UN easier and to improve this reputation. But when it's women, we still think they'll largely try to do this, but they have no relationships with the government or the elite who are reticent to engage because of the kinds of structural misogyny that both sides agree exists within these environments, right? We think the end impact of this is it leads to slower progress and more misogyny within these countries. Thirdly, backlash. We think this covers the more moderate cases. Countries like the UK, where there is still structural misogyny, but it tends to be much more widely called out, right? So men within these countries feel threatened and excluded by the motion. No, thank you. Ambassadors note that they never actually engaged or never actually proved how more female delegates leads to less sexism on the ground, but will engage as if they did, right? We think when ambassadors are no longer men, you do as a man, when you think ambassadors are no longer men, you don't think of like national pride or like, oh, I should probably be a feminist now. You think that your job will be the next one, right? We think this isn't helped by like reactionary media institutions within these countries who demonize it, who try and spread an impression that like feminism is threatening specifically, right? We think that also feminism needs these men, right? They can reduce they reduce misogyny and increase political capital of the movement as a whole. We think these men go from largely sympathetic to threatened and aggressive. But even if this doesn't increase misogyny against the most vulnerable women within these countries, because we've agreed that the women who do become ambassadors are privileged and experience less sexism, we think it halts progress and acceptance of feminist narratives. The impact. Prop's case prolongs misogyny in most of the world. It cements rather than deconstructs prejudice. I'll take a POI now.
So on your side of the house, there was crash against women asking for the vote to the point where women were actually killed about it. Would you have not then campaigned for the vote given that there's a massive misogyny that would have then presumably existed?
We think it's very different from like women asking for the vote. Women asking for the vote was equality, right? We get far less backlash against equality. When women have exclusive rights to like become ambassadors or to positions, we think this isn't equality, and therefore men feel much more threatened by it, right? Because they are now being discriminated against. Secondly, rebuttal to the conclusion of their case, right? That is less misogyny. Firstly, we think it leads to a mission accomplished mindset, which leads to less drive for like female enfranchisement because they already have like supposed representation. Secondly, are these women even feminists, right? We think they failed to prove this. Not all women are feminists, right? And the ones picked by the misogynistic elites, like outside Western liberal democracies, to be ambassadors are unlikely to be, right? They are products of their environment. They have incentives to cooperate with the agenda of the government. So Proposition's case falls apart when you imagine a world where these women argue against feminism in the United Nations, against feminism in the World Bank, right? Even in countries like the US, given that these women are likely to be the richest and most privileged, as Freddie's barriers analysis conclusively proved, they are least likely to have been impacted by sexism. They don't get catcalled, they travel in a limousine. They won't prioritize sexism within these organizations because they don't have the lived experience. The impact of this is it tackles the assumptions that found Sri Lanka's entire case. We think they lose on this ground. Thirdly, on weaker feminism, we think when you make feminism about the richest and whitest who are acceptable to the elite, it isolates people who don't look like them out of feminism. We think this leads to a worse movement. So the comparative, right? Latin gives you very clear alternatives for progress, like affirmative action, funding girls' education, international pressure. We think this are exclusive with the motion because, like, when Libya no longer lets you into the country to fund girls' schools, we think this leads to much worse harms on the ground. Their burden is to explain why it's better than why their motion is better than everything we do in the status quo. The response is, if it's so good, why do we not get more representatives? There's no reason as to why this is a good metric to measure the progress of feminism. We think this is symbolic in name only. We give you the status quo. Hundreds of millions of women lifted out of poverty, growing acceptance of third wave, intersectional feminism, fundamental and material change. Prop under our motion gives a marginal feminism that works only in the interests of the most privileged. Team Scotland.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes, 24 seconds. I thank the opposition whip for that fine speech and call upon the opposition reply.
Can I be heard?
Yes.
Great, cheers. I thought it was really telling today that Sri Lanka actually seemed really reluctant to talk about their motion and how it plays out, how it relates to their principle, and what it looks like in the real world, instead opting to go after the mechanism that we gave as a pure hypothetical about things that we maybe think might be more impactful under our side of the house, and instead opting for a load of principled argumentation that just didn't engage with the things that they actually are proposing to do in the real world. We think this showed the lack of connection that they have between their principles and the outcomes, and we think that this showed just like the extent to which they are reluctant to actually engage with what they want to do in the real world. Two questions are going to be really important when we're looking at this debate and who won it. Firstly, how do states respond to the move? How does this play out in terms of how a government reacts when the motion is passed? And secondly, just under which side, as a result of that, do we get more productive political change? So let's dive into that, right? How do states respond to the move? There was a comparative here of radicalization, right? There's a comparative here of which side takes a more radical approach that is going to get more radical responses from the government. We'd like to note that under this clash, proposition really liked to paint themselves as more radical and more extreme when they were talking about their principle, because their principle showed a really radical harm and therefore a radical solution, but really seemed to shy away from that radicalism when we asked them to confront how that plays out against the establishment, right? They really didn't want to talk about how their radical principle plays out in the minds of really regressive governments. We thought that was very interesting. Instead, the only thing they really told us was that all of our counter mechanisms are just as radical as theirs. In their absolute best case world, where that is the case, right, we don't think we have to do those counter mechanisms under our side. We can just continue as we are going at the moment. We can just not do any of that stuff. And at that point, they are introducing a motion which actively introduces harms and people pulling out of things, right? But then let's look at in our best case scenario, where we do introduce the counter mechanisms that we give you, because we tell you a few things about these throughout our case, right? Firstly, they're already happening to a really great extent, right? We already have quite significant affirmative action, funding for women's programs and diplomatic pressure against countries with bad rights for women. And guess what? Saudi Arabia is still in the United Nations. So is Iran, so is Russia, so is Brazil, right? We still have that engagement. We still have that level of buy-in. We don't think you get that when you specifically look at the way in which their motion looks, because they want to change. This is what we tell you right from the outset. They want to change the face of a country in the international community to having to be a woman. That is so unbelievably unpalatable for Vladimir Putin. That is something that Jair Bolsonaro just will never want to do. That is something that the Saudi Arabian government just really does not want to do, and seems like a massively undermining thing and an affront to their values by Westerners, right? That is something we tell you is especially harmful at the point at which we give you all this analysis that we think we gave you plenty of examples of about why international organizations already face loads of skepticism. That is the point side proposition provides a tipping point, right? So what happens at this point? Under which side do we get this more positive action? Because we tell you that under the status quo, we're already getting funding, we're already getting education reform and gradual assimilation. What happens under the motion? We think it still follows, with all the analysis that we gave you, that there is probably just a total withdrawal from loads of countries from these international institutions. That looks like no more on-the-ground aid for women. That looks like no political pressure. That looks like no assimilation to political values. Crucially, it also means that we just get way worse diplomacy on an international level. Of course, we massively, massively care about the women in these countries who are massively detrimented by various different things that we're currently solving. But we also tell you that it's a huge problem when international diplomacy is just seen as a less legitimate thing, because a debating chamber full of women is just going to be seen as so much less legitimate by these really sexist governments. It's because they fail to show you why their motion doesn't just cause a completely nuclear diplomatic reaction that side proposition lost this debate.
I thank the opposition reply for that fine speech and call upon the proposition reply.
Can you hear me if I speak like this? Great.
Yes.
Panel, side opposition commits the cardinal sin of conceding to the problem, giving us counter solution, and then pretending in Op3 and reply that, oh, this was never a counter solution. This was apparently some kind of like thought experiment that was meant to win them the debate. If they concede that a problem exists, and they consider also to the scale of the problem, that it was systemic, that existed globally, that it existed to the extent that it prevented women from getting into positions of power, I think they have to give us a counter solution or any defense of the comparative. It's not enough to say that continuing to implement existing system, which we demonstrated had not worked in the past and which they themselves conceded to, is going to win them the comparative. At best, on our side of the house, if we create even a marginal benefit, we win this debate. The refusal to defend the comparative loses them this debate. What are then the questions in this debate? Firstly, on the principal obligation of states. And I think there was categorically three things that they did not respond to. Firstly, they never responded to the obligation specifically and mandate of international organizations because they are, to a degree, constrained in what they can do. They can't do things like dictate domestic policy. But what they can do is control what kind of delegates are sent to their conferences. They can control what happens in those internal forums. To the extent at which that is true, I think we established that an obligation exists. Why then does this obligation extend to having exclusively women? It's because of the fact that it is the same concession that they made, that this is a global issue, that this exists in every single country. Under quota system, if Saudi Arabia gets to choose to have a man as the delegate, how is that addressing the global and systemic inequality that we've seen? They have not answered this question. And I think the degree of harm is something that they importantly concede to. And they want to have something like, I would approximate this to something like a 90% quota for women. I think on a balance, they're probably closer to what we want to achieve. So I think just on the basis of marginal benefit, you should give it to us. If you're conflicted about whether we want the practical benefit, at least we were able to prove to you that principally this is what women categorically deserve, and on a balance, we will that. But secondly, they're not pragmatic. Firstly, they're counter-solution. I'm still confused as to what exactly they support. Because apparently affirmative action doesn't mean quotas. I don't know whether those are, I'm not entirely sure whether those are two different technical terms, but I think generally affirmative action means quotas for minorities and greater representation. But the second counter solution was the most problematic because it was things like diplomatic pressure. Panel, think about where diplomatic pressure comes from. It comes from international organizations like the World Bank and the UN. They can't just fiat that they're all of a sudden going to put sanctions on Saudi Arabia because they don't give women rights if those international organizations still remain predominantly male. I think that's actually a counter solution and benefit that happens on our side of the house. I think the fact that there has been no demonstrable change from their counter solution wins us this debate on the basis of marginal benefit. But we also gave you additional reasons as to how when you have exclusively women in place, that you are able to get greater benefits in terms of the policy that you create. Because currently you have a system where men are able to deprioritize the intersectional impacts of international policy, like interventions, like economic recessions, because it's very difficult for a man who has been privileged their entire life to put themselves in the shoes of a woman. It is significantly easier for a woman to do that, regardless of what kind of economic background she comes from, because at least you have more approximate lived experiences. So I think we get better policy on our side of the house. And even if this policy is unlikely to materialize, we start the chain of reactions that is necessary for women to be represented in these organizations. We are going to have female delegates who speak out on behalf of the fact that women are disproportionately the victims of things like rape by the UNPKF. The second idea then, that's how you're going to have no buy-in. This is a hung case panel because all of their benefits rely on there being no buy-in. What were the multiple reasons we gave? We talked about the vested interest to educate your delegates, which means that you're still going to have competent women in power. We talked to you about shifting sentiments in international politics, the election of Joe Biden. We talked to you about how complete removal just wasn't going to happen. It's going to happen at the very best on individual agreements. We talked to you about economic and diplomatic benefits. We talked to you about the opportunity cost that you create when you lose out on these kinds of things. This criteria and collection of benefits means that you're unlikely to ever see an organization completely pull out. Even if we have partial membership to these organizations, you still get greater benefits when you not only have organizational membership, but also women in power who are able to represent the most disenfranchised. On our side of the house, we cater uniquely to women in a way that they can't side with side proposition.
I thank both teams for an excellent debate. I'll text the Facebook chat for us to be added into another room for deliberation, and we'll be back in hopefully under 30 minutes.
Thank you, guys.